All right, continuing on part 3, education. We started this last week, and this will be the second and last part of part 3. As I might have mentioned, that this will be the shortest part, probably. We spent a lot on the first 2 parts, and I really, there's a lot you can go into on education. I don't know that in a series like this is the time to delve so much into the education as far as the financial aspect of education. What I wanted to focus on mostly was laying the biblical foundation of our own character and the purpose for handling finances, and then also getting into some of the practical aspects of helps in it, practical helps regarding finances. But the education is important too, mostly because if you have at least some grasp on how things work and how things operate today, you can then use that knowledge to arm yourself with the knowledge so you have better understanding, so then you can hopefully make good decisions. Now, in the next part, part 4, which we'll get into probably starting next week, that is the action, putting things into practice. That will also include some education, so there's going to be some intertwining there, but this is basically some very basic education. I mean, there are a lot of resources out there that you can find to learn about how things work. I mean, there's a lot of things on the internet and to educate yourself on it. And I really debated, how deep do I want to go on education? I just decided we're going to keep it very basic, and hopefully it'll be a help. Maybe just give you a little bit of understanding how things work today. So let's go to the Lord in prayer tonight as we get into this. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time that we have this evening, and for this series that we can. I hope that it's a help to people, and that there are those who have learned from it so far, and that we continue to learn from it, and that most of all we'd put things into practice that are based on your word, that we'd live by the principles of your word and not live based on our own understanding or on the conventional wisdom of the world, but that we would follow your leading. And so, Lord, I pray that you would guide and help tonight, that you'd help me in conveying what is prepared, and that it would be proper and understandable for each one here tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Education. Now, starting out with a couple of verses to know. And the reason is that these 2 verses kind of make the foundation for the theme of tonight in what we're going to cover. First of all is Proverbs 11 and verse 1 says, "A false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is His delight." Now, that has a specific interpretation, but there are a lot of ways that you can apply a false balance and just weights. That God is a God of justice. He does not want the scales tipped in favor of one to the detriment of another. God is not for manipulation. And so a false balance is abomination. When people are being cheated, when people are being taken advantage of, it's kind of like if you go to the deli and let's say they, as they're putting that meat on, you notice how they don't hold their hands like this on the scale. They throw the meat on the scale. Why? So that it's very clear, you know, this is the meat, the meat's being weighed, and that's what you're going to pay for, the cheese or whatever you're getting. And but you know, a false balance would be as if there was something hidden that would tip the scale and make it a little heavier. There are certain states, I don't know if it's called this in Massachusetts, there are some states, I think they have what's called Department of Weights and Measures. Is it called here in Massachusetts? I couldn't remember if it was here or if it was somewhere else. Department of Weights and Measures. Why? Because making sure things are properly balanced, properly calibrated and measured. And you think about it, when you go to the gas station, you want to know that if you're paying $1.99 for a gallon of gas, you want to know that you're getting a gallon of gas. You want to make sure that pump is calibrated correctly. And so a false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is His delight. That God cares a lot about justice, and And we live in a fallen world, and we live in a world where the love of money is the root of all evil, and we do live in a world where people do take advantage of others, and people don't always do what's right. And so there does come a point when there's only so much justice that we can do anything about. When it comes to most of what goes on in the world, we don't have a lot of control over that, but we do need to be content and willing and trusting to leave it in God's hands that justice will ultimately be served when God is ready to serve that justice. But what does the Bible say? He does want us to do justly. And so one thing we can do is to operate in just and equitable, fair ways that delight the Lord. But what we find is in the financial system, because we live in a fallen world, we live in a sin-cursed world and with fallen man, that there are many things that are done in the financial realm that are meant to take advantage of other people. And that is, it's an abomination to the Lord when people are being taken advantage of. There's nothing wrong with making an honest living. There's nothing wrong with making profits. There's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with those things, but when there's cheating going on, when there's a false balance, and there's taking advantage of others, that is not right. And then the second verse is Proverbs 22:7. The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Very important biblical principle here is that the rich ruleth over the poor. You know, in the United States, or actually in a lot of the world, who are the people in the highest positions? Well, they're the rich people. That's just the way it is. And the borrower is servant to the lender. Now, how is the borrower servant to the lender? Because if someone borrows, let's say they take out a loan, it could be a car loan, it could be a personal loan, it could be a credit card, it could be a mortgage, any type of borrowing, you're entering into an agreement that you're going to pay that back at certain terms. And as one person said, you will do what the master says. They rule over you. You do what the master says. And if you don't pay, there are consequences to not paying. And so if, let's say, you have a mortgage and you just decide, I'm not going to pay my mortgage this month, and I'm not going to pay it next month, and I'm not going to pay it the month after that. There is time that eventually runs out. I have actually seen where someone has been over a year behind on their car loan. That's hard to even fathom. It really is. But I've seen that. And by the way, it's not a financial institution is not just looking to repossess a vehicle. It's expensive to go through that process. So any way to possibly work it out. But it's bad when a financial institution gets to the point we're going to repossess your vehicle, or we're going to go through that process. And and probably depending on the institution, it determines how long-suffering they are. But with a mortgage, and of course with COVID, there have been a lot of things that have changed, such as there are now ways that people can defer their mortgage payments and loan payments to help with hardships and things. So quite a number of things that aren't typical in this economy. But there are consequences. Or if you don't pay your credit card on time, or if you don't pay, if let's just say I'm just going to pay whatever I feel like, and I'm not going to pay the whole amount, or I'm not going to pay this month's, that's going to hurt your credit score. And in the next section, we'll talk more about a credit score, but I will say this, even if you don't borrow, we should care that we have a good credit score. Now, if you have no credit, that's different. But no credit is one thing, but having good credit versus bad credit, even if you have no intention of borrowing, you should care about having good credit as opposed to bad credit. And there are different reasons for that. There are credit checks that are done for certain employees. When I started working at the credit union, they did a credit check. Why? Because if I'm really bad with money and I'm in financial trouble, a credit union, a financial institution, is not a good place. There's increased liability on their part. Let's put it that way. Increased liability. And So it's not just about getting a loan that makes a difference in having good credit. So, and plus it's a good testimony if you have good credit. Once again, if you have no credit, then that's a whole different matter. But there are people who have bad credit and they should work to get that built up. But that's a whole other that's for another time. But the borrower is servant to the lender. People can get their houses taken away in foreclosure if they do not pay, if they do not follow what they have agreed to. And so there are consequences to that. You do what the master says. And by the way, the Bible says no man can serve two masters. Either you hate the one, love the other, hold to one, despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And there are many Christians who are held back from completely serving the Lord and living for the Lord because they're having to service the debt. But we'll get into more of that in the next section. But these are just some foundational verses that we'll get into a little more as we, or some of the principles of that. Now, you can't read that probably unless you have really good eyesight. And the intention was not to read that. But this is one of the areas where I decided to keep it very simple. Because there are different economic schools of thought. There are different philosophies on how an economy should operate. And so, but the main thing I wanted to point out is that we have a lot of human tinkering with the economy. And that's part of history, is that humans like to tinker with the economy and financial policy and all these things. And there are different ideas of how best an economy should be set up. And so there are these different ones. One is and I'm not going to read through all these as far as each line, but the one that I wanted to focus on is the very bottom. It says policy recommendations. And so at the top is each one, and then as it goes down along the side, those are different categories. But the bottom is policy recommendations. Now, the classical believes in a free market. Just kind of leave things, let things go, let the market decide. The neoclassical, free market or interventionism, depending on the economist's view on market failures and government failures. So neoclassical could be either way. Marxist, their policy recommendation is socialist revolution and central planning. You know, it's always best to plan things at headquarters, that you get the experts together and they know what's best for everybody. And that's the Marxist school of thought. There's also the developmentalist, which their recommendations are temporary government protection and intervention. Austrian school of economics believes in the free market. The Schumpeterian is ambiguous. Capitalism is doomed to atrophy anyway. I'm not familiar with that one. Keynesian, active fiscal policy, income redistribution towards the poor. And by the way, in the United States over the last few decades, the Keynesian economists are the ones who have had a lot of influence in that. And they go, and Keynes was a socialist. And then institutionalist, ambiguous. Their policy recommendations are ambiguous. It depends on the economist. And then the behavioralist, no strong view, but can be quite accepting of government intervention. And so that's why I wanted to emphasize the idea, and as we get along here more, the idea of a false balance. Because whenever you have fallen man intervening more and more and more, guaranteed it's going to create more and more problems. And but what happens is people get so insecure and so worried about their livelihood, about their money, that once there's intervention and once there are things that are taking that are done to take care of people, a lot of times people don't want to let that go. They just love more and more intervention. They get used to that. And so that's the direction our country has been heading for many, many years. It just continues on in that path. When things are just left to themselves. We certainly need government. We certainly need some sort of maintaining of order and structure. But at the same time, what we need is more liberty and not the intervention of fallen man, because man doesn't always know best. And by the way, it goes to show that the fact that there's all these economic schools of thought are an indication that there's a whole lot of different opinions out there. There are a whole lot of different opinions. And but though that's just wanted to give you that overview, not going into all the details of that. But if you're interested in more, just do a search, economic schools of thought. If you want to learn more about the different ideas that are out there and how all that works, there's certainly a lot of things out there. Words to know. Words to know. Inflation. Inflation is a continuing rise in the general price level, usually attributed to an increase in the volume of money and credit relative to available goods and services. And we'll get back to that one. Deflation, a contraction in the volume of available money or credit that results in a general decline in prices. So in other words, inflation means greater prices, usually because the volume of money is increased, and then deflation is the opposite. That's a contraction of the available money and results in decline in prices usually. There's a word called disinflation, which is a reversal of inflationary pressures. And then there's stagflation, which is persistent inflation combined with stagnant consumer demand and relatively high unemployment. Just to give you an idea of why that's what that's all about is our policymakers these days in the Federal Reserve, they shoot for having inflation every year. They say we want an average of, we want pretty much a target of 2% inflation. So we want 2% inflation every year. And there's probably problems with the way they even measure inflation. I think it's distorted how they even measure the inflation rate. Because when they say there's only 1.5% inflation, and then you look at your bills and you see how things are going up, you say, boy, it sure seems like bills are going up more than 1.5% this year. But anyway, the idea is if we have just the right amount, if we can tinker with the system just enough, that we get just the right amount of inflation, that'll help the economy, there's more money available, but then that'll help the employment, and then we'll get to full employment, and they have all these geniuses, and yet the problem is they've been shooting for inflation years and years, and they can't seem to get to their goal according to their own statistics. But stagflation is when you have that persistent inflation, but you're not seeing the benefits of increased consumer spending and increased employment. You don't want, it's a bad place to be to have inflation and a high unemployment. Not a good place to be there. So once again, getting back to inflation, what is inflation? A continuing rise in the general price level, usually attributed to an increase in the volume of money and credit relative to available goods and services. And so this goes back to the causes of inflation are supply and demand and currency devaluation. So the supply and demand, there are numerous factors that influence prices. So just because you have an increase in the money supply doesn't mean that all prices are going up the same amount. There might actually be certain prices that go down, like certain TVs get cheaper every year. Black Friday, they're just blowout prices on televisions. And electronics, certain electronics get cheaper. And there are certain things that go down in price over time, and then there are others that go up. So it's never across the board, never across the board. But supply and demand is one of the biggest factors regarding prices. And now here's the thing about supply and demand and the rising and falling of prices. The rising and falling of prices is not inherently a bad thing if it happens naturally, because they help to regulate, the rising and falling of prices helps to regulate supply and demand, and supply and demand helps regulate the rising and falling of prices. I'll give you an example. This year, with the coronavirus, back in the spring, it was really hard to find bicycles. it was really hard to find bicycles. Why? Because when people had to stay home, they were wanting to get outside and do something, or maybe they were off of work, or there's just different things. Everything was thrown into turmoil and upheaval. And so one of the things that people did was they decided, I'm going to get outside, I'm going to do some bike riding. So it was pretty tough. There was a shortage of bicycles. And it wasn't just the demand, it was also the supply. The bicycle manufacturers, because of the supply disruptions, most of them come from China, the supply disruptions in China made a shortage of bicycles available. So you have an increase in the demand for it, and then you have a shortage of supply. And so what did that mean? Well, it means that you were not going to be seeing some blowout sales on bicycles. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that prices rose dramatically on bicycles, because probably, especially your specialty bike shops, they have I don't know what the markup is on bicycles, but a lot of these specialty places probably make a decent amount as far as a markup on their prices. So they don't necessarily have to raise their prices to make a profit. And plus, what happens is if they raise their prices and somebody else stays low, well, then people are going to go to the lower price. And eventually there's only so far you can raise prices. So that doesn't mean the prices themselves went up that much, but there weren't great blowout sales on bicycles. And seasonally, plus it's a good time of the year where more bicycles are going to be sold anyway because it's the spring. Now you get to the fall, that's a good time to buy a bicycle. Or early winter, that's a good time to buy a bicycle because people aren't thinking about bicycles as much. And so that's the way you can think to kind of beat the inflation pressures sometimes, because if it's based on supply and demand, try to buy something at a time when it's not in demand as much. There are certain items where it doesn't matter when you buy it, it's going to be about the same price, but that's a cause of inflation, is supply and demand. And so the bike sales, also bike racks. Bike racks. I was looking for a bike rack this summer, and I looked at one on one website, and I thought, well, I don't know, I really want to pay that much. I was looking for a one that locks, and I thought, it was going to be another month until it shipped, and I decided I'm going to order a different one, and then that turned out to be a whole fiasco. And but then later on, I went back onto the original site when I saw the one that I really actually wouldn't mind having, and the price had dropped. It was later on, late summer, early fall, and the price had dropped. I thought, wow, now it might be a good time to buy it. I didn't buy it at that time, and I don't know what the prices are now. But what happened? They got more supply in, and probably not as many people are buying bike racks. So they dropped the price. They dropped the price. So certain items you can really make have some good savings on that. Like I said, not all items. But supply and demand are factors in inflation, in the rising and falling of prices. Also currency devaluation, another one, which this is where you get into the false balance. The false balance is devaluation. Devaluation is when you reduce the value of the currency relative to other currencies. Devaluate, or at least in the current economic system, it's a reduced value of the currency in relation to other currencies, because that's how currencies are measured, is in relation to one another. Devaluation is accomplished by increasing the money supply, which is caused by increasing debt. And one of the ways to increase debt is low interest rates. So when the idea is if the interest rates for borrowing get lower, more people are going to borrow, and then that stimulates the economy because you have all this extra money going into the economy, more consumption, and that helps everything. And that's the way it's said to work. So that gives a boost. That's good for the economy, is what the idea is. And the problem is it doesn't always work. It really just depends. And the other thing is, what it does is it punishes savers, because if borrowing is cheap, you're not going to get a good return if you park your money in the bank. Even for CDs, I mean, you're not going to get much of anything. And so this has to do with the tinkering of we live in the world economy is dominated by central banks in Europe, in Great Britain, in China, Japan, and many places, and then of course the U.S. we have the Federal Reserve, and so they control interest rates, and the interest rates they control it's their target rate, and so what they try to do, that's the rate that is set that banks charge when they lend to each other. So it deters them from parking their money. It's supposed to act as a prompting of lending their money instead of parking it and just getting a return on their money for just letting it sit there at the Federal Reserve. When that doesn't work, which it doesn't always work, I mean, low interest rates are not always the cure, because I mean, just too much medicine, the system gets used to that medicine after a while. And so you got to resort to other things. And when that doesn't work, the government resorts to directly spending more money, which results in more debt and more money creation. Because in our banking system, the banks lend more money than they actually have. They just have to have a certain percentage of their deposits compared to how much they are lending. And so they're really lending involves the creation of more money. So there's there's a new theory out there as far as the school of economic thought it's called modern monetary theory. And the modern monetary theory is it doesn't matter how much debt the government runs up. We just need to spend, and inject as much money as we can into the economy. It really doesn't matter. And that's one of the more recent ones that some are proponents of. And it's usually your socialists like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and people like that are more pushing for that type of thing. And here's a few statistics for you about the national debt and who holds our debt. The public holds about 3/4 of the national debt. The rest of it is government agencies owing it to each other. But foreign holders owned about, as of July 2020, 6.81 trillion. Japan owned 1.29 trillion, and China owned 1.07 trillion of U.S. debt, which is more than a third of foreign holdings. The Federal Reserve and government hold about 10.16 trillion. Mutual funds have about 2.5 trillion. So if you have mutual funds or investments that they invest in bonds, that's investing in the debt. If they invest in U.S. government bonds, there are different types of bonds. State and local governments, including their pension funds, hold about 1.14 trillion. Private pension funds, 819 billion. Insurance companies, 244 billion. U.S. savings bonds, 150 billion. And then there's other holders, such as individuals, government-sponsored enterprises, brokers and dealers, banks, bank personal trusts and estates, corporate and non-corporate businesses, and other investors hold about 1.79 trillion. And so, in other words, the whole point is debt is a big part of our economy and big part of investments. And so my point is that our economy is basically built upon debt. And there's a book that I've read, and Sean has it, he read it, and the author makes a really interesting statement. He says, if all debts were paid off, our money would disappear. There'd be no money left. If all debts were just paid off. That's hard to even wrap the mind around how that even works. But when you think about it, well, everything's based on debt, and if there's a multiplication if there's actually more money being created than there actually is sitting in the bank, and then all the debts got paid off, where would the money come from? I mean, so we live in a debt-based, a debt-reliant economy. But supply and demand and currency devaluation are two main causes of inflation. There are a couple of historical examples of devaluation. One is ancient Egypt. Around the year 210 BC, due to the economic problems caused by the Fourth Syrian War, the king of Egypt, Ptolemy IV, devalued the currency in an attempt to recoup some of the costs of pursuing the war. Ptolemy IV changed the unit of currency in Egypt from the silver drachma to the copper drachma. The king hoped that by doing so he would be able to recover the silver coins that were currently in circulation, which he would then use to pay for the war debts. Instead, very little silver was recovered because it was no doubt hoarded when news of the economic plan became known, while more and more bronze coins were introduced into circulation, creating a classic inflationary cycle. Not understanding the nuances of inflation, other Ptolemaic kings allowed the cycle to continue for some time until King Ptolemy VI, he reigned from 180 to 145 BC, reintroduced silver drachmas back into circulation. The process happened again about 100 years later when Ptolemy the 12th devalued the currency by adding impurities to the coins. During the years 53 and 52 BC, the purity of silver coins dropped from 90% to 33%, which caused a major spike in the prices of goods. And then also in ancient Rome, although the Romans kept few records that were directly related to their devaluing of the denarius, the records they did keep, combined with examinations of coins from the period, tell the story of a deliberate attempt to stretch the silver they had as far as they could. Similar to the situation in Ptolemaic Egypt, the Romans began adding impurities to their silver coins so that more could be added to circulation. The process had two results. There were too many coins in circulation, and the new coins that were being added were comprised more of other metals than silver. It is estimated that the inflation rate reached an astronomical 15,000% between AD 200 and 300. In terms of a tangible example, 1 Roman pound of gold was valued at 72,000 denarii in AD 301, which would be nearly impossible for any Roman to have that many coins on his or her person. Finally, the Emperor Diocletian, ruled AD 284 to 306, realized that drastic measures had to be taken if he were to save the Roman economy and quite possibly Rome itself. By AD 250, the inflationary cycle had crippled the Roman economy and threatened to bring the entire empire down. Instead of attacking the problem at the source by addressing the currency problem, Diocletian instead decided to enact price controls in 301. The edict only made things worse as it drove consumers to the black market, but the prices continued to soar. Suffering from myopia and a lack of understanding of economics, Diocletian's successors, for the most part, were also unable to stem the tide of inflation and, in fact, kept many of his policies, including price controls. Basically, the point and moral of the story is governments generally like inflation. Why? Because they're basically taking from their people more for themselves. Because there are really three ways the governments can pay their bills. You have to pay their debts, you should say. You either have to raise taxes, you have to slash spending, or you can just devalue your currency, which makes your debts that you currently hold worth less to the creditors. And so that's usually the way governments like to go, because people don't even realize what's happening. And so, raise taxes, you get a bunch of people pushing back against raising taxes. And then slashing spending, we cannot slash spending, we got to safeguard these programs and these expenditures, and we got to be paying for all of this and all of that. So both of those are politically challenging for leadership, and so inflation is then what they can resort to try to cut corners. And that ends up being a false balance. Because the money that I very rarely have cash on me, but this time I do. So if I hold a $20 bill in my hand, inflation means, continually, if I hold this $20, I'm not doing anything with it, but yet after a year, after 2 years, 3, 4, 5 years, it's worth less than what it was before. It's still $20, but it will get me fewer goods for $20. And so that's why it's such a false balance. If things are let go naturally, eventually the system finds an the whole cycle finds an equilibrium where it's self-regulating if things are just left to themselves. And so where we're at as a country now is many people are blaming capitalism for economic problems, but it's not true capitalism. It's what I call, what's been called crony capitalism, where you have people who are pushing and pulling the levers of power and influence to benefit themselves. And so what people are saying is when they blame capitalism, they want to go to socialism. They think that's the answer. Well, these greedy capitalists, they go socialism as the answer, realizing that it's not truly a free market. There are fingers on the scales. The scales are being tipped. That's what needs to be focused on. So this is just a little history of dollar devaluation, it's similar to the chart I showed you last week. The purchasing power of the dollar starting in 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, by the way. So if you had a dollar back then, and then this was up through 2016, you can see how much the purchasing power of the dollar has eroded. And that's why back in the day you could get, 15-cent hamburgers or, whatever, penny candy. And think of the astronomical increase of, what percentage increase would that be? If you got penny candy and now you have to pay 50 cents for that same piece of candy, I mean, that's a large percentage increase. How many thousands of percent increase is that? That's a lot. And so we see that is what has happened. So all this is for your benefit to understand that yes, if it's challenging to make ends meet, if it seems like things get more challenging to pay bills and prices go up and some prices go down at different times, there's fluctuations, like the price of oil goes up and down a lot of times based on supply and demand, not just the value of the dollar. So there are many factors, but overall, just generally speaking, this is where we're at. The current influence of inflation, so why don't we see even more astronomical prices? Because much of the inflation or much of the increased money supply has gone into housing, high demand for housing. When interest rates are really low, that spurs more demand for housing. And same thing with stock market prices, is when you have more money being pumped into the system, a lot of the money that was supposed to be lent out during the housing crisis back in 2008, 2009, that they were pumping money into the economy. The Federal Reserve was, the government was, and pumping money into the banking system. And they were supposed to lend it out to help spur the economy, but much of it went into the stock market, and then the stock market just took off. And same thing is happening today. And another thing that's driving stock market increases is when interest rates are so low and you can't park your money in CDs and get a decent rate of return, people are going to turn to more risky investments like the stock market. Nothing wrong with investing in the stock market, but it is riskier than parking your money in a CD. And then I'll just try to move through here pretty quickly. Debt, and more debt. Just to give you some statistics where we are. By the way, I'd never visited this site, or at least it's been years, and there's a ton of numbers on this site. If you like a whole screen full of numbers moving and look, go to usdebtclock.org. It's really interesting. I didn't realize, I thought it was just showing the debt, but no, this actually has tons of numbers, tons of numbers. It's very interesting, usdebtclock.org. National debt is $27 trillion. To put that in perspective, our entire gross domestic product is about $21 trillion in the United States. So the debt at this point is about 128% of the gross domestic product, our economic productivity. And COVID accelerated the national debt. It was already skyrocketing before that and by the way, it doesn't matter which political party's in power. They all have spent like drunken sailors. The Republicans and Democrats do not. There's a few lone voices crying in the wilderness about fiscal responsibility, but I'll just be honest with you, the Republicans get serious about fiscal responsibility once the Democrats get back in power. And then once they're in power, they spend just as much as Democrats do. That's just the way it works. And that's not my opinion, that's a fact, okay? So I'm not being partisan or biased here, I'm just saying that's a fact. Home mortgage debt is $10.5 trillion. Student loans, $1.5 trillion, auto loans, $1.2 trillion, and credit cards, $893 billion as of first quarter of this year. And then corporate bonds, that's the corporate debt, $9.6 trillion, which has gone up 20% in 5 years. So many companies in drastic debt. So, finishing up with this, is America blessed or cursed? Is America blessed or cursed? Well, we look to the Bible for that. If we measure blessing and curse based on how God was measuring Israel, well, we can see the answer in Deuteronomy 28. So just turn there in closing here tonight. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 12. Actually, I'll read verse 1, but we'll jump down to verse 12. I'll read the first couple verses, then verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 28. This was God's message to Israel. as they're coming into the promised land, as they are, all right, you're going to dwell in this land. Here's if you do this, this is what happens. In Deuteronomy 28, and it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all His commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. And he goes through the whole list of blessings. But if you go down, one of the blessings, or one of the indications of God blessing them, in verse 12, the Lord shall open unto thee His good treasure, the heaven, to give the rain unto thy land in his season, and to bless all the work of thine hand. And thou shalt lend unto many nations, and thou shalt not borrow. So God said to Israel, one of the ways that there would be an indication of my blessing on you is that you would be a creditor, not a debtor. You would be lending to many nations, but you would not be borrowing. But then look down at verse 15, but it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all His commandments and His statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. And he goes down through the whole list of curses there. And Deuteronomy 28:44, go down all the way down to verse 44, it says, He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. And so one of the indications of God's curse upon Israel, if they did not hearken to His words, they did not obey His voice, listen to His word, is that they would end up being a debtor instead of a creditor. They would be last. They would be low and not high. They would be... If they did God's word, if they obeyed God's word, if they did what He wanted them to say, they followed His commandments, then one of the blessings would be you'll be a creditor. You'll lend, but you're not going to borrow. You'll be set up on high as of the nations, ahead of the nations, and then, but not below, not the last. And so based on, if we were to measure America's blessing or curse based on what God said would happen to Israel, we'd have to say that America is not really blessed. America is actually cursed. That the huge debt load, the whole system we have that's based on debt, is a curse to America, or an indication of a curse on America. And I would say, America as a whole, as a nation, is in great rebellion against God, against God's word. There is a lot of spirituality in America. There's a lot of even so-called Christianity in America. But as a whole, if you look at the statistics of the polls that have been done, even, which I don't even put much stock into them, but it's interesting at least. There's a group that does a poll about every year of what are America's most and least Bible-minded cities. And the places down south and the places where you'd think, these are the most Bible-minded, they only have about 50%. That's the top, is 50% in these polls, or low 50s. The lowest is, actually this region. Albany, New York, Providence, Boston, even Springfield made the list, I think, last year. And those are really low. Like, I don't want to throw out the numbers maybe. If I had to throw out numbers, I would say 10, 15% maybe. I don't know. That's Bible-minded. That's Bible-minded. That's not church-going. That's Bible-minded. And I forget all the criteria of how they decide. And that's a poll. Like I said, it could be off somewhat, but I think it's pretty reflective of where we are as a nation. Seattle, Washington's very low on the list as far as a low percentage. There's certain places. So America as a country is in quite a bit of rebellion against God. And could it be that maybe the politicians we get, they make the decisions of how much money they're spending, and all these policies could just be a reflection of what America has become? And I was thinking about that. I thought, I don't want to say all those things right at the end of the message to depress or discourage you. But the fact of the matter is, we as individuals can't really change that. There needs to be a widespread changing of thinking across America for any of that to change. And by the way, we've come so far that there will be no drastic changes. But at least, it'd be nice to see some steps in the right direction. But I tell you what, we can't really do anything individually about solving America's about solving America's debt problems and dealing with America's financial management, other than, we just need to vote some right people into office. But even when you think you're voting the right ones in, it doesn't change anyway. But I tell you, we can do something about our own financial situation, our own financial management, our own debt, if you have debts. And debt is one of the major things that hangs over people. It's such a burden. Such a burden. And so the reason we stop there with the blessing or curse and the whole issue of lending and debt is the fact of the matter, no matter what debts you may have, if you have any, we at least should, and I'm kind of using this as a transition into the next section next week, but we should at least have the right attitude toward debt. And saying that as Christians, we should at least dislike it enough that we think it's a priority not to get into any further debt or to pay off the debts we have and at least go the right direction. That should be the mentality, our mentality of a Christian. Remember, the very first verse we looked at is, the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Well, as Christians, who are we supposed to be serving? Well, we should be serving the Lord. We should not be having to service so many debts. And so that should be at least in the heart of us as Christians. Let's do what we can. If we've got things we got to take care of, we got to get in order, let's get those in order. Or if you've got some things in order, well, don't fall for the conventional wisdom and fall for the stick, the carrot and the stick they hang out there of 0% for well-qualified buyers for this brand new vehicle. 0% interest? Boy, sign me up. Well, you'll be paying on a brand new vehicle for the next 7 years. That'll lose about a third of its value when you drive it off the lot. You want to go for that? You want to fall for that? Or you want to say, no? And this is why the character aspect is so important, the whole issue of contentment. Because if we have the right character, the Christian character we should have, we aren't going to be as likely to fall for those other things that the world has out there and think the way the world thinks. We shouldn't be thinking the way the world thinks. And so we're going to transition into that coming up next week.